Kate had a hysterectomy? How can she have had Archie? Can somebody please answer that? While Prince Harry was outside proudly announcing, I had a, in my opinion.
From the moment the pregnancy was announced, something about the story never fully settled, and it wasn't because of one explosive detail or a single shocking moment. It was quieter than that. Slower, a buildup of small inconsistencies that, over time, formed a pattern people couldn't ignore. At first, most dismissed it as internet noise, the kind that always surrounds high-profile figures. But as months passed, questions didn't fade. They multiplied. And when recent comments from a close family member resurfaced old concerns, the conversation shifted from fringe speculation to something far more unsettling. Not because anyone made a dramatic accusation, but because the official version of events began to feel incomplete. And when clarity is missing at this level, people start looking for answers elsewhere. For years, rumors surrounding the pregnancy had circulated quietly, often buried in forums or brushed off as conspiracy talk. One theory in particular kept returning, no matter how aggressively it was shut down. Reports claimed Meghan may have undergone a hysterectomy years earlier, something mainstream outlets quickly labeled impossible and irresponsible to discuss. Yet the rumor never fully disappeared. It resurfaced every few months, usually triggered by another unexplained detail, another contradiction, another unanswered question. What made it persist wasn't sensationalism, but the lack of transparency. Each attempt to silence the discussion seemed to amplify it, and that alone made people pause. Because if nothing was wrong, why did even basic clarifications feel so guarded? That lingering curiosity took on new weight when Samantha Markle spoke publicly again. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize. She didn't claim insider proof. Instead, she did something far more effective. She calmly pointed out timelines, biology, observable details that had been publicly visible for years. Her tone wasn't hostile. It was measured, almost clinical. And that's what made people listen. She didn't tell anyone what to believe. She simply suggested revisiting what had already been seen. And once people did, the story felt different. Less like gossip. More like a puzzle with missing pieces. One of the biggest issues raised was timing. Pregnancy timelines are remarkably consistent because biology doesn't bend for image management. Yet in this case, public due dates subtly shifted. Announcements arrived later than expected. Milestones didn't always match visible progression. Interviews referenced weeks that didn't align with prior statements. None of these details alone proved anything. But together, they created friction. When timelines don't align, people notice. And when those timelines involve royal succession, scrutiny becomes inevitable. Samantha didn't frame this as deception. She framed it as math. Dates either work or they don't. Then there was the baby bump. Over time, it became its own focal point. Some days it appeared dramatically pronounced. Other days, noticeably smaller. In certain public appearances, it seemed to move or shift in ways critics found unusual. Supporters argued it was clothing, posture, camera angles. And those explanations worked. Until they didn't. Because the moments kept happening. And instead of escalating the rhetoric, Samantha addressed it quietly. She pointed out how Meghan often cradled her stomach during minor movements, yet appeared unusually mobile in other moments that typically challenged late-term pregnancies. These weren't accusations. They were observations. And the consistency of those observations kept the conversation alive. What truly intensified scrutiny, though, wasn't visual. It was logistical. Royal births follow tradition for a reason. Not spectacle, but verification. Occasions are disclosed. Medical teams acknowledged. Documentation signed. In this case, nearly every step broke precedent. The palace struggled to confirm basic facts. Journalists received conflicting answers. Hospital details shifted. Statements didn't align. Meghan later referenced avoiding a hospital entrance that reportedly didn't exist. Documentation appeared delayed. Senior physicians, traditionally named, remained silent. The explanation offered was privacy. But privacy doesn't erase process. It simply limits access. And here, the process itself seemed absent. Prince Harry's role further complicated the narrative. For years, he was portrayed as supportive but passive, swept along by events rather than shaping them. But reports and testimonies suggested otherwise. Claims emerged that he attended appointments, approved schedules, reviewed details. If true, that reframes everything. It suggests this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was coordination. And suddenly, Harry's later behavior made more sense to critics. The anxiety, the fixation on leaks, the reported paranoia. Not the actions of someone protecting privacy, but of someone guarding a fragile narrative. This framing didn't demonize him. It humanized him. And that made it more disturbing. Inside palace walls, the implications went far beyond public opinion. Royal succession laws are not symbolic. They are rigid. A child must be born of the mother's body unless surrogacy is formally declared. Titles aren't gestures. They're legal acknowledgments, and yet Archie and Lilibet were included without any such declaration. That contradiction alone would be enough to trigger internal concern. Because if the rules were broken, intentionally or not, the consequences would be constitutional, not cosmetic. Reports claimed legal discussions began quietly, not to punish, but to prepare. Because once lineage is questioned, the monarchy itself becomes vulnerable. Then came the detail no amount of PR could neutralize: the possibility of DNA verification. Unlike interviews or statements, science doesn't respond to narrative pressure. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't reinterpret. It simply confirms or denies. Reports suggested legal teams were preparing documentation, that a public challenge could emerge, and suddenly silence became risky. Because refusing clarity now looked less like dignity and more like avoidance. If the claims were false, verification would end the conversation instantly. If not, the consequences would be historic. For years, Meghan and Harry managed criticism through reframing, sympathy, selective disclosure. And often, it worked. But this situation was different. It wasn't fueled by emotion. It was fueled by unanswered questions that had accumulated for years. One inconsistency at a time. One missing document. One unexplained timeline shift. The story didn't collapse because of a single revelation. It collapsed under its own weight. And now, what once felt like distant rumor has become an unavoidable confrontation. This is no longer about reputation. It's about truth versus narrative. Transparency versus control. And the reason this story refuses to disappear is simple. When clarity is withheld, speculation fills the space. Whether the final answers vindicate or expose, one thing is certain. This story can no longer be outrun. The fairy tale didn't fade. It fractured. And whatever comes next won't be shaped by opinion, but by what can finally be proven as the narrative continued to unravel. Attention shifted to something even more unsettling than speculation itself: the pattern of resistance. Whenever simple verification was requested, in situations involving public figures, especially royals, transparency has always been the tool used to quiet rumors. Yet here, transparency was consistently replaced with deflection. Requests for clarification were labeled intrusive. Questions were reframed as cruelty. And anyone pushing for answers was accused of bad faith. But that strategy only works when the facts are solid. When details remain unclear, deflection becomes suspicious. And that's exactly where this story began to change shape. Because people weren't asking for private medical records. They were asking for consistency. And consistency never arrived. One of the most confusing elements remained: the birth announcement itself. Traditionally, royal births are marked with clarity, even when privacy is requested. A simple confirmation, a signed notice, a clear location. Instead, the announcement came from Prince Harry alone. Delivered in an unusual setting, far from a hospital backdrop, with details that raised eyebrows almost immediately. His account of the timeline felt rushed, oddly casual, and in parts contradictory to later statements. He spoke of rapid discharge, of returning home within hours of events unfolding with almost unrealistic speed. Medical professionals quietly noted that the timeline he described didn't align with typical post-delivery procedures, especially for a first birth. Once again, defenders rushed to explain it away. But explanations only multiplied the questions. Then there was the silence from those who usually speak. No senior doctors came forward. No midwives were named. No hospital staff acknowledged involvement. In every previous royal birth, at least one medical authority confirmed their role, not for publicity, but for protocol. This time, there was nothing. That absence became impossible to ignore. Silence isn't proof of wrongdoing, but in this context, it was deafening, and it created space for speculation to thrive. Because when no one verifies the basics, people assume there's a reason. Old footage began resurfacing, re-examined with fresh eyes. Moments that once sparked mild curiosity were now scrutinized in detail. One clip in particular circulated endlessly. Meghan bending forward as her bump appeared to fold sharply, unnaturally. For years, the debate around it went nowhere. Some blamed fabric. Others blamed angles. But as more inconsistencies stacked up, the moment felt harder to dismiss. It didn't look like a wardrobe malfunction anymore. It looked deliberate, controlled. What made this situation uniquely volatile was the legal dimension quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Unlike celebrity scandals that live and die in public opinion, this one intersected with constitutional law. Succession isn't flexible. It doesn't bend to modern branding or personal preference. Rules are written, enforced, and rarely challenged. And according to those rules, eligibility hinges on specific criteria. If any part of the birth story was misrepresented, intentionally or not, the implications would ripple far beyond one family. Advisors reportedly began reviewing precedents. Quiet discussions took place, not because guilt had been established, but because the risk was too great to ignore. At the center of it all were two children, and that reality complicated everything. Because regardless of how this story began, its consequences extend to lives that didn't choose the spotlight. That fact alone explains why the palace, if concerned, would move cautiously. This isn't about punishment. It's about safeguarding an institution built on lineage and legitimacy. And once those pillars are questioned, every decision becomes heavier. The idea of a DNA comparison emerged not as a threat, but as a solution. In a world saturated with spin, science offers clarity. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't speculate. It confirms. Reports claimed legal representatives were prepared to push for verification, not to embarrass, but to end uncertainty. Because uncertainty is corrosive. It erodes trust. And at this stage, trust had already been stretched thin. What made this moment unprecedented was Meghan's position. For years, she navigated criticism with skill, redirecting narratives and reframing conversations. But this was different. There was no interview that could smooth it over. No statement that could reframe biology. Silence risked appearing evasive. Speaking risked opening doors that couldn't be closed. For the first time, control seemed out of reach. As more documents were rumored to be reviewed and legal pathways explored, the story took on momentum of its own. This wasn't a media frenzy fueled by outrage. It was a slow, methodical reassessment of years of unanswered questions. Each inconsistency, once isolated, now connected to another. Each missing detail gained new weight. And the public began to realize something unsettling. This story didn't escalate because someone spoke out. It escalated because no one clarified. The image once presented to the world was polished, modern, and resilient. A couple breaking tradition while honoring it. A new chapter for the monarchy. But narratives built on omission are fragile. And once they crack, they don't collapse quietly. They unravel publicly, one thread at a time. Now, the situation stands at a crossroads. Either transparency arrives, ending speculation once and for all, or silence continues. allowing doubt to solidify into belief. Whatever the truth ultimately is, it can no longer remain theoretical. Too many questions have been asked. Too many patterns identified. Too much time has passed without resolution. This isn't about believing rumors. It's about understanding why they survived for so long. Because rumors fade when facts are clear. They only grow when clarity is withheld. And at this point, the story isn't chasing attention. Attention has caught up to it. What happens next will define more than reputations. It will define trust. And once trust is broken, it doesn't quietly return. It demands answers. And those answers, for the first time, may not be optional, as the pressure continued to build. Another uncomfortable realization began to surface. This situation had reached a point where doing nothing was no longer neutral. Silence, which once functioned as a shield, had slowly transformed into a statement of its own. Every week that passed without clarification didn't calm the conversation. It sharpened it. Online discussions grew more focused, less emotional, more analytical. People weren't asking if something was hidden anymore. They were asking why it had been handled this way from the start. And that shift marked a turning point. When curiosity becomes methodical, stops being rumor, and starts becoming investigation. What unsettled many observers was how aggressively the narrative had been curated early on. Certain details were shared with great emphasis, while others were conspicuously absent. Emotional storytelling replaced factual grounding. Personal anecdotes were offered where documentation was expected. And while that approach works in interviews, it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Over time, the emotional framing began to feel like a distraction, not a clarification. People noticed how often critics were attacked rather than answered. How quickly discussions were shut down rather than addressed. That defensive posture didn't suggest confidence. It suggested fragility. Another layer that intensified speculation was the retroactive reshaping of the story. Statements given years later subtly contradicted earlier accounts, not dramatically, but enough to raise flags. Timelines were softened. Details were reframed. Certain moments were suddenly described as misunderstood. But memory doesn't overwrite footage. Photos don't adjust to new explanations. And when the past is publicly documented, revisions stand out. Each reinterpretation only reminded people that the original version had gaps that were never filled. Behind closed doors, reports claimed concern wasn't limited to public reaction. Legal advisors allegedly weighed scenarios no one wanted to face. Not because conclusions had been drawn, but because institutions plan for risk, not certainty. And the risk here wasn't scandal. It was precedent. If rules governing succession were perceived as flexible, trust in the entire system could erode. That's why this situation carried such gravity. It wasn't about one family's choices. It was about whether centuries-old standards still meant what they claimed to mean. What complicated everything further was the emotional appeal surrounding the children. Any questioning was framed as an attack on them, a tactic that effectively silenced discussion for years. But eventually, that framing began to crack. People realized that asking how something happened isn't the same as questioning a child's worth. Transparency doesn't harm children. Confusion does. And placing them at the center of unresolved controversy only ensures the conversation will follow them for life. That realization made the call for clarity feel less cruel and more necessary as the months went on. The narrative lost its momentum. Not because interest faded, but because credibility did. The more tightly controlled the story became, the more artificial it felt. Authentic experiences rarely require this level of management. Real timelines don't need defending. Real events don't require constant correction. And that contrast lingered in the background of every discussion. People began asking a simpler question than before. If nothing about this story was unusual, why did it need to be handled so unusually? The idea that this could all end with a single act of transparency became increasingly unavoidable. Not a tell-all interview. Not a carefully worded statement. Just confirmation, documentation, verification, something solid enough to stop the cycle. And yet, that moment never came, which led to the most damaging perception of all. That clarity was being avoided because clarity would complicate things further, not simplify them. At this stage, the story exists in a kind of limbo. Not proven, not disproven, suspended by years of unanswered questions and carefully managed silence. But limbo is unstable. Eventually, something tips the balance. A document surfaces. A legal request moves forward. A confirmation is issued. Or someone with first-hand knowledge speaks plainly. And when that happens, the conversation will change instantly. Not gradually, instantly. What makes this moment so striking is how preventable it all was. Early transparency could have shut everything down. Clear time, standard protocol, minimal explanation. Instead, secrecy turned curiosity into suspicion, and suspicion into something much harder to contain. The story didn't grow because people wanted drama. It grew because the basics were never settled. Now, the question isn't whether the rumors were fair. It's whether the silence was wise. Because once doubt takes root, it doesn't disappear on its own. It waits. And the longer it waits, the more power it gains. Whatever the truth turns out to be, it will eventually surface. Stories built on control rarely survive without it. And when control slips, facts take its place. This situation has already passed the point of quiet management. It's no longer a whisper. It's a question standing in plain sight, unanswered. And unanswered questions don't fade. They demand resolution. And as that unanswered question lingered, something else became impossible to ignore. The way the conversation itself had evolved. Early on, it was emotional and polarized, framed as loyalty versus cruelty. But now it sounded different, cooler, more deliberate. People weren't arguing about personalities anymore. They were comparing statements, dates, photos, and protocols. They were lining things up side by side and noticing how often they didn't match. That shift mattered because once a discussion becomes evidence-based, it's much harder to dismiss. You can call critics biased, but you can't argue with timelines that contradict each other. And slowly, the emotional shield that once protected the narrative began to weaken. What also stood out was how selective transparency had been. Certain aspects of the pregnancy were shared in great detail when they served a purpose, while others were completely closed off. There were emotional reflections, symbolic moments, carefully chosen anecdotes.